It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. In the State of the Union speech on Tuesday, President Trump reiterated his recognition of the opposition leader Juan Guaido in Venezuela.
2 weeks ago, the United States officially recognized the legitimate government of Venezuela and its new president, Juan Guaido. And we condemn the brutality of the Maduro regime, whose socialist policies have turned that nation from being the wealthiest in South America into a state of abject poverty and despair.
Meanwhile, more countries recognize self-proclaimed Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela and have pledged humanitarian aid to him for assisting Venezuelans. The U.S. has promised $20 million, Colombia $40 million, and Canada $53 million. Venezuela's President Maduro is rejecting the aid, saying we do not need charity. We want everyone to release Venezuelan government's billions of dollars that are held in assets all over the world. These funds have been used as sanctions against Venezuela, so it cannot assist its own people. Now, joining me now here in the studio to discuss the latest developments is the renowned actor and activist Danny Glover.
Thank you very much, Shiv. Thank you.
Danny, you have a very special history with Venezuela, and with the Chavez government previously. You were invited, you were a regular visitor with Chavez, you're a friend of Chavez. Since Chavez has died, you have also, on the invitation of the Venezuelan government, has visited Venezuela many times. Mm-hmm. And I say all of this, A, for transparency, and B, for over a decade and a half, you have built up your expertise, your knowledge, your inside understanding of the crises that Venezuela has been experiencing during this long period of Chavismo. And I think it's important for us and for people on the left for us to have an honest conversation about the way in which we defend Venezuela. And I say we because I myself, in the interest of transparency, worked with President Chavez for 4.5 years at Miraflores, and someone who very much believed in the revolution and what was possible in terms of another world that Venezuela was trying to forge at the time. With that in mind, and this history and the knowledge and the advice you yourself has given to the Venezuelan government, I want to ask you, how do you feel and how do you actually respond to your government and many European countries and now many Latin American countries recognizing self-proclaimed Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela?
Well, with all due respect, to any analysis of Venezuela, we have to go back a little ways. The planning for the conference on racism and xenophobia, which took place in Durban, South Africa in 2001. And there have been years of planning, there have been movements relative to Afro-descendants, changes that have occurred after the end of military dictatorships in the respective countries in Latin America. So we go back there. There's a renewed this explosion of energy and democracy, democratic principles, and all those things, adjusting to the past wrongs that have been done through the military dictatorship and historically throughout Latin America. I mean, when we look at that, then on top of that, we have the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, in Brazil in 2003, when my first time to go to Brazil, and one of the first times at the beginning of a long-term relationship with Latin America. But we saw so many things happening. We saw things were happening in Bolivia. Evo Morales came out of the struggle against privatizing the water in Bolivia. You go on and on and on. You had Lula da Silva, who had run many times for president and won, and all these new changes that were happening. It seems to be a new nexus around real transformative changes, relationships, nation-to-nation relationships, CARICOM, Petro-Caribe, all these different news, the idea of the Bank of the South, all these ideas were set in motion at this particular time. It's an explosion of people's energy, a repudiation of the neoliberal paradigm that they had suffered through, and the exploitation of the natural resources, the exploitation of indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera. All of this was laid on here. And at that particular point in time, and I'm trying to assess all of this, because we talk about Venezuela, but we see what is happening in Argentina, Ecuador, Chile, which had one coup in 1973, now is moved further to the right, et cetera. Brazil, which has moved further to the right, and the most elements who are most endangered are the most progressive, most enlightened parts of the Brazilian transformation, the Landless Movement. MST. Landless Movement has placed more than 400,000 families on vacant lands, and it's transformed the relationship that not only citizens have with the state, the nation state, but citizens have with themselves as well. So this whole thing we're watching, we watched and we saw this, we witnessed. We were drawn to it. The left may have criticized parts of it. It didn't go far enough. What was explained as socialism may have been considered to be social democratic, et cetera, et cetera. But this movement was in process and everything else. At the same time, all these conspiratory forces were there to try to undermine it, to limit its effectiveness, and in some subvert it. And those are things were happening. And we see this in Venezuela, especially because the ideas came out of Venezuela, because Venezuela is not a country of 200 million people. So it's difficult to get a consensus among 200 million people, It's a country, a small country. So the sample size of building 2 million homes, of training doctors, of having doctors service communities, the barrios and other communities that had been disenfranchised and not served, all that was doable in a way, to eradicate literacy. All this was doable in a sense. So all these things, which we would think of in the world, were necessary demands for the human existence and their progression in their lives and everything. Those things were happening right here. So what we see now in a brutal attempt, whether it finds itself in the illegal imprisonment of Lula da Silva, or the illegal coup that occurred, the coup that happened, legislative coup that happened with Dilma Rousseff. So all these things are happening right now. And as we get more and more information about what's happening, as you share the information about the humanitarian aid, quote unquote, that's provided. Now what you've done is you've taken the billions of dollars that rightfully belong to the Venezuelan people, and what you've done is you've taken those billions of dollars, you place sanctions on it. They can't use their own money, their own resources, and then you come with as like this. This armor, this knight in shining armor to save them and everything, with a few $1 million of quote-unquote humanitarian aid, which we don't know where that money goes to. But this is a very, very concise plan, a plan that was laid out and with certain contingencies and certain possibilities, and always be adjusting to the dynamics that were happening internally in the country here. And I think that's the point about whether we could argue about Maduro, what he did, what he didn't do. We can go on to that. But for one thing, we have to take into fact the sanctions, the initial sanctions placed by the Obama administration, which, interesting enough, in this sense, maybe included simply just those people who were in governance and everything, those people who were part of the governmental apparatus, you know. But at the same time, now it's moved to attack the people in direct, specific ways. The hyperinflation, we can make an arguments about what the Venezuelans could have done in terms of dealing with inflation, and essentially what has turned to hyperinflation, which in some sense is the death knell of any country with hyperinflation. You can't get anything done. There's the black market, which dictates a great deal of how currency flow is and everything else. So whatever we talk about, this becomes this moment. The danger that we have now and the danger that we see is a full-scale conflict which will just decimate not simply simply the gains that were made by this action called the Bolivarian Revolution over the last 20 years. You know, this is the attempt to kill that is what is on the table and had always been on the table. You know, power always, in this sense, this corruptive, dangerous power that this country has always attempted to diminish people's expectations. I don't care if it's Mayan Indians in Guatemala. I don't care if those who fought for independence against the Sandinistas who fought for independence and won their war. Whatever it is, it's to diminish their expectations. So I think I don't think. How do we talk about it? Yes, it's disappointing. You know, we've been on the Center for Economic Policy and Research. Other organizations have been on this 24/7 for some time, trying to find a way in which we could push congressional leaders, push certain people to the point of, first of all, questioning the historic relationship that the U.S. has had with Latin America, but and trying to find a new relationship with Latin America, you know, and as I listen to this, and we talk about conspiracies and everything else, but there's a conspiracy. Whatever the conspiracy is, it's a spirit to undermine the will of the people, and that has happened, the will of the majority of the people. You know, from attempting to delegitimize the elections when the Carter Institute said that these are the best elections in the world. I mean, we studied these elections. It's been books reported. They've reported before Congress or whatever, this is the best election in the world. So any way to undermine this, because there's a deeper pathology here, and it may be that all we do might not be enough.
Let's talk about that pathology, the deeper pathology you talk about. It is absolutely clear that countries that have supported and recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela has a certain interest in Venezuela. Now, I can say to you myself that Canada has a particular interest in Venezuela, and that's a financial one. That's a trade one. They actually own a number of the leases to the gold mines. It's not only oil that, you know, Canada has a lot of oil. Canada's not interested in the oil. But they have interest and leases in gold mines, nickel mines, bauxite. There are diamonds, rich mines. And all of this is what's driving, say, Canadian policy and interests of the Lima Group, and why now Canada is doing the bidding for Donald Trump and for John Bolton and others. But talk a little bit about the interests, the capital interests driving foreign policy here.
Well, For a long time it's had. We think about the nation state and everything, but the nation state is in so many ways has it's something dissolved into relationships that purely depend upon the multinational corporations. You know, when corporations, in some sense, David Corden wrote, corporations rule the world. They dictate policy. They can anything create a currency crisis that destabilizes economies anywhere they want to do this. That's the issue. So it's the nation state now. In some sense, is represented by these corporate interests, which have the interest in raw materials. You know, and certainly we can look at the world. You know, one of the major issues is that perhaps Africa has never had the kind of clear, because of the way the role colonialism played, and that because there was no major figure like Simon Bolivar, who came in and expressed a certain identity in terms of Latin America and people of South America as well. Because it wasn't there, that it has the same problem. Look at the Congo. You know, we sit around and exist. Is it the Congo? Is Congo? There's been 3 billion people been killed in the Congo, and that it's been a kind of acceptable acknowledgement that has occurred in the Congo. But it's Africa. You understand? And in Africa, with all of this so-called dysfunctionalism and everything else. So the same thing is happening. But there's a strong currency within the way that Latin Americans see themselves. You know, you find it in every aspect of the cultural life, the poetry, the great writers that have come there, the great writers who talked about this certain kind of identity and a sense of their own entitlement and self. And basically, the Bolivarian Revolution centered on Simon Bolivar, and who was in some sense, in some ways, what's called the godfather of this sense of determination, independence that it resonates in. So the question is that what happens in these internal wars? What will happen if there's a civil war in Venezuela? And what impact will that civil war have on the rest of the region, particularly fragile countries who are struggling with themselves? Small Uruguay, 3 million people, trying to find their answers within their own new identity and relationship with Bolivia. What impact does that have on Bolivia now? And Evo Morales. And we see that. So all of this, that's the other danger of further conflict. What impact does that have on Caribbean countries as well?
Speaking of Caribbean countries, CARICOM came out in a very strong statement denouncing the self-proclamation of Juan Guaido as president, and they recognized Maduro as the president of Venezuela, and denounced at the UN Security Council meeting anything but the recognition of Maduro. Now, except Haiti. Haiti recognized Juan Guaido, and this was very interesting to me, particularly given the history that you're talking about, which is of Simon Bolivar, Haiti, and the alliance with Venezuela. And you are a scholar. You have followed what's going on in Haiti for a very long time. Why this departure now?
Well, I mean, Haiti had its attempt, short-lived as it was. In 1990, 1989, 1900, it elected a priest, you know, a charismatic priest who talked about Haiti and his own responsibility to the Haitian, who revitalized the idea the Ottabanni River and Valley should be a rice-growing, should provide, and had been for most of most of its existence as a nation, provided self-sufficiently, provided rice for the Haitian people. So they were able to grow there. They became self-sufficient in rice. Now they were importing rice from Iowa and other places because they had been, because of the new arrangements, the new structural adjustments, or the new arrangement that this neoliberal paradigm. They find themselves dependent upon imported rice and everything. That it's always, we see it. We see all these countries. We see Mexico and what is happening in terms of just corn itself. That corn comes from other places in the world, that farmers cannot feed themselves and cannot produce corn and at a price that is profitable, and while they can maintain their life and everything else, and keep from starving and everything. So all those things. This is one picture of this is the picture of Venezuela, with the enormous. I mean, what I think the most egalitarian usage of national resources that we've seen in a long while. I mean, in that period of time, taking those resources and turning those resources into places where they benefited its people and everything else, it's a dangerous precedent. And that's what do we draw from this? You know, we can talk about all the liberal ideas that we want and all the ideas of independence and self-sufficiency and everything else. But when a country attempts to become self-sufficient in its own way, and thereby its self-sufficiency allows them to place demands on themselves and place demands on those who attempt to alter or change that, that's another reality. And I think, one of the things, the game is not inconclusive. You know, there are many things that can happen in this whole process, you know, and maybe there could be some sort of arrangement in which we don't have, not simply, we don't have the eradicating of all the things that have been so dear and have been so accomplished. So many things have been accomplished in this moment. It's 20 years. It's a short period of time, 20 years, and but it's very discouraging.
Yeah. One last question to you, Danny. Much of the international media, much of the international community tries to portray Nicolas Maduro as a dictator. If you were to do a search on the internet and coverage of Venezuela, you will often find the word President Maduro followed by dictator or dictator Maduro. Is there any evidence to such a claim as President Nicolas Maduro as a dictator?
There's no more than there was a President Chavez as a dictator. You know, people elected them, movements elected to them, and we seem to redefine or define dictator in ways, the word dictator, in ways that are useful. So you drive that into people's consciousness. This pathology, you know, if you drive that into people's consciousness, that a person is the dictator, then in some sense they accept that in ways, subconsciously, unconsciously, because it's been drummed into their memory, no matter all the information that refutes that. Whether it's free elections, whether it's transparent elections, whatever, the question is that. The question is always going to be what they hear, what they perceive. And, you know, I find that people that I respect on the Hill have used that as that platform, you know, as in their culture. And like I said, I can only, yeah, but he's not. He hasn't. No more than Hugo Chavez was a dictator, you know? And same as they say, maybe the fact that they entitled to certain services, that they as citizens are not active citizens. These were active citizens. These weren't citizens. These were active citizens building in the course of building something they believed in. And like I said, because of the vast amount of resources, because it's only 26 million people, the stakes were higher in some sense. The possibilities were higher in some sense. And for us who were able to watch that and to watch them redefine nation-to-nation relationships, whether it was in Argentina, a larger country in population, whether it was small Caribbean islands, whether it's the ideas that spun out of this and the possibility, that whether it's in a relationship. But like I said, there's something else deeper here, too. And that is the other place that is on the hit list is a country that had the 60th anniversary of their own revolution, and has fought embargoes, sanctions, and everything else for all this time, and perhaps have found new partners in China, and despite the fact that there is now, because there were doctors in Venezuela, doctors in Brazil, doctors in other places in Latin America, doctors around the world, in which they play this marvelous role of not only training, but supporting doctors. This is Cuba. Training, supporting doctors. Now, they're pushed and put in a crunch as well. And there's large migrations of Cubans because of the lockdown on Venezuela, the lockdown on Brazil, the lockdown on all those previous partners that they had in the hemisphere. Now will have an impact on Cuba. And certainly, who knows what's going to happen at this particular point in time.
I've been speaking with Danny Glover. He's an activist and actor. I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.